Hello, my dear students. In today's class, I will take another aspect of working capital management, that is, factors determining the size of working capital. There are so many factors which determine the size of working capital. I will explain the factors one by one. The first factor is nature of business. As you know, mainly there are two types of business concerns. The first one is manufacturing concern and the second one is trading concern. If a business concern is a manufacturing concern, usually it needs more working capital because manufacturing concerns need more labor and raw materials. For purchase of raw materials and for payment of wages, we need working capital. Hence, manufacturing concern needs more working capital. On the other hand, if a business concern is a trading concern, it needs less working capital, less amount of working capital, because the trading concern does not need labor and raw materials. This is the first factor, that is nature of business. We come to the second factor. The second factor is scale of operation. The size of working capital depends on the scale of operation. If a business concern which operates in a large scale, which produces in a large scale, usually it needs more working capital. On the other hand, if the business concern engages in a small scale, then it requires less working capital. Hence, the size of working capital depends on scale of operation. The third factor is length of operating cycle. Operating cycle means the time taken to convert raw material into cash. If the length of time is more, then it requires more working capital. For example, heavy industries like shipbuilding industry, aircraft manufacturing, or construction of dams, etc. In these industries, the length of operating cycle is more. Hence, they require more working capital. And where the length of operating cycle is less, such industries need less working capital. Hence, the size of working capital also depends on length of operating cycle. This is the third factor. And the fourth one is rapidity of turnover, where the turnover is rapid, where the business concern has good turnover ratio, then the requirement of working capital is less. And the business concern which registers less turnover ratio, that business concern needs more working capital. Hence, the size of working capital depends on rapidity of turnover. Another factor is nature of demand. If the demand for a product is constant, stable, the working capital requirement is less. If the industry which produces goods and the goods which has demand, the demand is constant, the demand is stable, and that industry requires less working capital, less amount of working capital. But if the demand is not constant, if the demand is not stable, if it is flexible, if the demand is flexible, then the requirement of working capital is more. Hence, the size of working capital is also depending on the nature of demand. Next factor is the sixth one, that is nature of supply. If the supply is regular and certain, supply of raw material is regular and certain, then that industry needs less working capital, because it need not to stock, need not to keep more stock, more raw material in stock. Hence, it requires less working capital, less amount of working capital. If the supply is uncertain, if the supply is irregular, then the size of working capital is big. Size of working capital is big. So that is nature of supply. And next one is credit policy. If a company which adopts policy of selling goods on credit basis, then it requires more working capital. If the company which sells goods on cash basis, then it needs less amount of working capital. It is the another factor which determines the size of working capital, that is credit policy. Next factor is level of profits. Level of profits. If the business concern which earns huge profit, if the business concern has if the business concern is highly profitable, then it needs less amount of working capital, because profit itself contributes to the working capital. If the business concern which earns less profit, then it needs more working capital. So the level of profit is also determining the size of working capital. Next point is taxation policy. The industries which require to pay huge taxes, heavy taxes to the government, then it needs larger amount of working capital. Larger amount of working capital. So this is another factor. And the last one is the dividend policy adopted by the company. If the company which declares high rate of dividend, if the company which declares interim dividend, then it needs more working capital, because it needs cash, more cash to pay out the dividend, amount of dividend to the shareholders. If the company declares less rate of dividend, or if the company does not declare the interim dividend, then it needs less amount of working capital. These are the various factors which determine the size of working capital. Thank you.